Snow fell. A harsh wind howled. The forest stood silent, a frozen cathedral of ice and shadow. 4 friends hiked deeper, their laughter echoing through the trees. Mark, the leader, checked his watch. Dusk approached. "We should set up camp soon," he called out, his words lost in the wind. They pressed on, the snow crunching beneath their boots. The temperature plummeted. The forest grew darker, the silence deeper. Emily, always the optimist, shivered. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said, her breath forming a cloud in the frigid air. John, never one for the cold, grumbled in response. They walked on, unaware of the darkness gathering around them. The last rays of sunlight faded. The forest was now a labyrinth of shadows and frost. Mark stopped, counting heads. "Where's David?" he asked, a knot of worry tightening in his stomach. They called out David's name, their voices swallowed by the wind. Panic began to set in. They searched for any sign, any trace of their friend. Nothing. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The temperature seemed to drop even further, the air thick with dread. Emily's cheerfulness had evaporated, replaced by a growing terror. John, his face pale, scanned the woods, his eyes darting nervously. Mark, trying to remain calm, fought back a surge of despair. David was gone. They stumbled upon it. A splash of crimson against the pristine white snow. Blood. Fear, raw and consuming, gripped them. They followed the trail, their hearts pounding in their chests. Each footprint in the snow, each broken branch, amplified their terror. The trail led them deeper into the forest, away from the fading light of the setting sun. The trees thinned, revealing a clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated cabin, its windows dark, its door slightly ajar. A sense of foreboding hung heavy in the air. The trail of blood led to the cabin door. They exchanged terrified glances, their breath frosting in the freezing air. They had to go in. The inside of the cabin was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of decay. They fumbled for their flashlights, their beams cutting through the gloom. Dust motes danced in the pale light, and then they saw them, 2 glowing red eyes, watching them from the far corner of the room. A low growl sent shivers down their spines. The eyes vanished. Darkness enveloped them once more. The silence was shattered by a blood-curdling scream, followed by the sound of splintering wood. Then silence again, heavy and absolute. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the forest in a shroud of white. The next morning, the police arrived. They found the cabin empty. No sign of a struggle, no trace of blood, no evidence of the missing friends. Only silence. The frozen forest kept its secrets. The nightmare, it seemed, was far from over.
The village of Rafsanjan was old, very old, ancient, some might say. It was the kind of place forgotten by time, nestled high in the mountains where winter lingered longer than anywhere else. Snow piled up in drifts that reached the rooftops, blanketing everything in an eerie silence. At the edge of the village stood a house. It was a tall, skeletal structure, its windows like empty eyes staring out at the world, the paint peeled from its walls like scabs, revealing the rotting wood beneath. Villagers whispered tales of the house, tales of disappearances, of strange noises, of a coldness that seeped into your bones. They said no one who entered during winter ever returned. Sam scoffed at such stories. He was a man of logic, a firm believer in reason, and he had no time for superstitious nonsense. When his jeep rumbled into Rafsanjan, its arrival shattering the village's quiet, he came seeking answers, not ghost stories. Sam had heard the whispers, the warnings to stay away, but he was determined to uncover the truth behind the legends of the haunted house. He parked his jeep at the edge of the village, a lone figure silhouetted against the gathering storm clouds, and headed toward the house. The wind howled like a banshee as Sam stepped onto the porch. Snow swirled around him, a blinding curtain of white. He could feel the gaze of the villagers on his back, their worried eyes burning into him, but he didn't turn back. He wrapped his coat tighter around himself and pushed open the creaking door. The air inside was frigid, heavy with the smell of decay and something else, something unnameable, that sent shivers down Sam's spine. He took a step inside, the floorboards groaning ominously beneath his weight. The storm raged outside, but the silence inside the house was somehow louder, more oppressive. The house was a labyrinth of shadows and dust. Cobwebs clung to every surface, thick and grey like shrouds. As Sam ventured deeper, he could hear whispers, soft, sibilant murmurs that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. He stopped, his heart pounding against his ribs, straining to hear. The whispers grew louder, swirling around him like the wind outside. He could almost make out words, but they were distorted, unintelligible. Then he saw it, scrawled on the wall in what looked like dried blood. Turn back. A chill ran down Sam's spine, colder than the winter wind. He took a step back, but it was too late. The floor gave way beneath him.
Snow fell, thick, heavy flakes that swallowed the world in white. The old train station stood forgotten, its tracks vanishing into the swirling snowdrifts. A young man, bundled in a thick coat, huddled on the platform, his breath a plume of frost in the biting air. This was the last train out, a rarely used line that snaked its way through the mountains. He boarded, the carriage door groaning shut behind him like a weary sigh. The train was nearly deserted. A scattering of figures sat huddled in the flickering gaslight, their faces obscured by shadows and the gloom. He found an empty seat, the worn velvet cold beneath his gloved hand. Outside, the snow fell relentlessly, blanketing the world in silence. The train lurched into motion, a low groan vibrating through the carriage. It picked up speed slowly, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels against the tracks the only sound in the heavy silence. He looked at his reflection in the grimy window, a pale ghost in the gathering darkness. Something about the emptiness of the train, the stillness of the other passengers, sent a shiver down his spine. He tried to shake off the feeling, focusing on the rhythmic sway of the train. The other passengers remained motionless, their faces hidden in the shadows. He wondered who they were, these silent companions on this journey into the heart of the storm. An old woman sat across the aisle, her head resting against the window, a worn leather suitcase clutched in her gloved hands. He tried to catch her eye, a silent question in his gaze, but she didn't move. It was then he noticed, with a growing sense of unease, that none of the passengers had moved. They sat like statues, wrapped in an unnatural stillness. He cleared his throat, the sound loud in the silence of the carriage. "Excuse me," he said, his voice hesitant. "Do you know how long this journey will take?" There was no answer. The old woman didn't even turn her head. His unease deepened, twisting into something cold and sharp in his gut. He looked at the other passengers, his heart pounding against his ribs. They were all facing forward, their bodies unnaturally still, their faces lost in the shadows. Night fell, swift and absolute. The temperature in the carriage plummeted, the air growing thick and heavy. His breath formed clouds of fog, swirling around him like phantom tendrils. Fear, cold and clammy, tightened its grip on his chest. He tried to rationalize the situation, to find a logical explanation for the stillness, the silence, the growing sense of dread that pressed down on him. He leaned closer to the old woman, his voice a strained whisper. "Ma'am?" he asked again, reaching out a hand to touch her arm. His fingers brushed against something cold and unyielding like touching stone. With a gasp of horror, he jerked his hand back. That's when he saw it, or rather, what he didn't see. There were no eyes beneath the brim of the old woman's hat, just smooth, featureless skin. Panic swelled in his chest, choking him. He stumbled back, his gaze darting from one passenger to another. They were all the same. Faceless shadows, their bodies draped in the worn fabric of coats and hats, their forms shifting in the flickering gaslight. He fumbled for the door handle, his fingers slick with sweat and fear. It wouldn't budge. The train rattled on, the only sound the mournful wail of the wind outside and the hammering of his own heart. The train screamed into the night, a phantom hurtling through the blinding snow. The world outside was a white void, the only indication of movement the swirling flakes against the window pane. He was trapped, a prisoner in a metal coffin with what? He didn't dare think the word, didn't dare give voice to the terror that clawed at his sanity. He huddled in his seat, his back pressed against the cold glass, his eyes wide and unseeing. Time lost all meaning. Hours or minutes or years could have passed. The train began to slow, its momentum fading as it approached. Nothingness. There was no station, no sign of civilization, just the endless expanse of snow and the dark, looming shadows of the mountains. And then, with a final shuddering sigh, the train came to a halt. The lights flickered and died, plunging the carriage into darkness. He heard a scratching sound at the window, like claws on glass. He squeezed his eyes shut, his breath caught in his throat. When he finally dared to open his eyes, the train was gone. He was alone, standing in the snow, the wind howling like a banshee around him. The abandoned station stood silent, a dark silhouette against the swirling snow. Years later, long after the tracks were swallowed by the earth, locals would tell stories of the train to nowhere. They would speak in hushed whispers of the young man who boarded the last train on a snowy winter's night. And some would swear that on the anniversary of his disappearance, when the wind howled and the snow fell thick and fast, they could still hear his screams echoing through the abandoned station.